Welcome to the PIDE webinar. My name is Nadeem Ul-Haq. Today we are going to have, inshallah, एक बहुत अच्छा वेबिनार आपके लिए जो आपको पाकिस्तान की टैक्स और फिस्कल सिचुएशन पे बहुत रोशनी डालेगा. But to begin with, let me welcome Finance Minister Shaukat Tarin, who has graciously accepted to chair this session on Zoom. Mr. Shaukat Tarin is here with us, and I would like him to give his opening remarks before I turn to the main webinar. Shaukat Tarin Saab, over to you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I would like to also wish my friend Tisham, all the best. I think he's had a challenging, health issues, which I think he's been facing very bravely. And he and me, we go back, long time. And when we worked together on tax reforms, when I was the finance minister here in 2008, 2010. And I remember Tisham was, of course, had the energy and obviously the intellect. And if we were together, because I left midway through, if we were together, we probably would have seen a more progressive taxation system in Pakistan, the last 10 years. But today, I think the subject is fiscal policy and sustainable growth. Clearly, what we need today is an inclusive and sustainable growth in Pakistan over a long period of time. And this is what, the think tank which we created through the Economic Advisory Council proposed that if we have to grow in a sustainable manner, there are certain structural imbalances which have to be corrected. And one of the structural deficiency is low tax to GDP. And that is because we only have 3 million, taxpayers in a country which has a population of 220 million. So whatever we did, let's start from what this government inherited. There were multiple challenges, both external account, fiscal side, and the very fact is the growth, which was 5.5%, was not on solid foundations. So the government tried to bridge the gap in the external account and external payment, which was north of $30 billion from the friends of Pakistan, including Saudi Arabia, China, Qatar, UAE, but could not come up with enough money, had to go into the IMF program. And IMF program was front-loaded because we have had, I would say, not very happy experiences with the IMF. And this was our 22nd IMF program. So they were front-loaded. Currency was depreciated from 104 to 165 rupees to a dollar. Discount rate, was jacked up to 13.25 from around 10%. Tariffs were increased both in electricity, gas, and the economy went into a nosedive. I think the 5.5% in 2017-18 actually went down to less than 2% in 18-19. we were then stuck with COVID, and COVID obviously affected the economy even more than before. Although the IMF gave us a kind of a recess and for a year or so, but the effect of COVID, despite the fact it was very, very well handled by Prime Minister Imran Khan through targeted, lockdowns, and kept the wheels of the economy moving. He also paid attention to all those industries which actually create employment, which is the housing sector. Housing sector in our country never took off because of the foreclosure laws, but Prime Minister Imran Khan, through his perseverance, actually got that law enacted, and that kicked off the housing sector, the mortgages. And then he paid attention to the agriculture sector, which had been neglected, and 4 out of 5 crops last year were bumper crops. Thirdly, he just paid attention to the export industry and the local industry and gave incentives. So that meant that Pakistan, rebounded, and in 2021, the growth went up from negative 0.5% to 3.94, and we suspect that this is the growth was in excess of 4%. So now, where do we stand? We stand by just saying, by focusing on growth, and the growth we are focusing on, we believe, should be on solid footings. We believe that unless we do not increase the revenues, we do not, bring in fiscal discipline, we do not have the resources, we will not be able to oil our economy towards growth. So the revenue targets have been increased quite steeply, and our revenue targets this year will go up from around 4.7 trillion rupees to around 5.882 or 83 trillion rupees, a growth of around 23-24%. Now, in an economy which is just coming out of an ICU, I think this is like a very ambitious target. But we are now using all kind of technology, all kind of progressive, instruments to broaden the tax base, and also to increase, our penetration into the retail market. So you'll be very happy to know that in the first 2 months, the revenues are around 45% better than last year, and around 23% better than the target. So we basically believe that we are on our way not only to achieving the 5.8 trillion rupees of revenues, I think we should exceed them. And my target to my people over here is that if we got to be very progressive. There should be 2 taxes, income tax and consumption tax. And then, this should be done over a period of time, and we should remove all the other kind of taxes, like withholding taxes, etc., etc. And I've given them a target of, achieving 20% tax to GDP within the next 7 to 8 years. My own sense is we should do it, earlier than that. But in any case, it's never done before, and I do not want to just have over-ambitious targets which we cannot, achieve. So this year will just be a barometer how successful we are with our strategy. But clearly, for stability and sustainability, fiscal discipline will have to be one of the key initiatives of this government. We'll have to have, of course, more developmental, expenditure, and curtail our, current expenditure, which obviously has been increasing rather rapidly in the last few years. I just know that, Ihtisham would love to be here to help me. But Ihtisham, I'm coming to Washington to seek your guidance and advice. And this would be middle of October. And we'll have, time together. I'm bringing, the governor will be there, but more importantly, my finance secretary will be here with us as well. So thank you very much for giving this opportunity to just, talk about our fiscal side, the revenue side. Obviously, there are other things which we are doing, and, we are, for our growth, we are, giving space to our productive, sectors of our economy. The agriculture, we're spending a lot of money after decades. We're spending money on the industry consolidation and the export industry, technology, and infrastructure. We're also spending money on social protection. And for this first time in our history, we have said that we are not going to wait for the trickle-down effect, which we believe our growth rate will exceed 5%. We are not going to wait for that, because we do not have sustainable growth. We have had not the sustainable growth in the past. The trickle-down never reached the bottom segments of our society. So we have decided that we are going to do some bottoms up in a very innovative manner, whereby we are using the larger banks to wholesale credit and the microfinance banks and microfinance institutions, NGOs, to retail, because they know how to do it. They've been doing it for the last 30 years. And the commercial banks have never been able to give small loans. So this way, what we have done is we have just played on the strengths of both of them. It's a unique model which we are going to implement from starting this month, late this month. We're just first going to do in 2 provinces, and then launch, full blast, early next year. This will basically give people interest-free loans for agriculture, for enterprise, for housing. We'll give them the health cards, and we'll also give them, ability to train one person in their family in technical training. All this you will see, migrate us from just the handouts which we are giving nowadays in ISAS program to people who can earn their own bread, working, and in a very honorable manner. So that by itself is a major initiative. It's not going to cost us too much, because it's only subsidy, and first year subsidy is no more than 10 to 12 billion rupees. But as we just grow this portfolio, obviously we'll have to give a little more money. But let me tell you what, I've talked to people, whether farmers or urban, a kind of household people, and they said that, their income levels go up by 40%, because this is like, they've never got this kind of break. So I believe, not only that, we'll start growing at the apex level through capital formation, we'll also start, strengthening the lower stratas of our society, creating entrepreneurs. And that will be an inclusive and sustainable growth. So it's going to be very interesting, very challenging. My biggest challenge is I got to control the politicians, because elections are in 2 years, and everybody and their uncles want money. So I got to make sure that it is a well-controlled kind of effort, although we want to be aggressive, but it should not be that aggressive that we blow the whole kind of scheme. We're seeing a little bit of increase in, but we're seeing growth in the imports. As I told you, we are seeing growth in revenues. So there is a little pressure on our rupee. I believe that that will obviously not blow over. We are taking corrective actions. Today we just made sure that some of the frivolous or expensive non-essential imports we try to curtail through regulatory duties. So that's where I am, and thank you very much, Nadeem, for inviting me. I will again wish my friend Ihtisham health, and also will seek his advice as always. Thank you.
Thank you, Finance Minister. That was a very good overview of the Pakistan economy and your initiatives, which I think are very welcome. We appreciate you giving us a very, very nice overview. Thank you very much. We shall be in touch with you again and carry on this conversation further. Now let me move on to introduce our session on fiscal policy for sustainable growth and accountable governance. Can Pakistan learn from China or Mexico? As you can see from the title, our speaker, Professor Ihtisham Ahmed, knows both China and Mexico very well. Ihtisham is well known in Pakistan. As the finance minister mentioned, he's worked in Pakistan, he's advised Pakistan governments, he's a well-known economist, in fact, one of our best economists from Pakistan. Ihtisham is no stranger to you. But let me briefly tell you about Ihtisham. I might add, he's one of my childhood friends, and that's probably why he's such a good economist, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. Ihtisham has been at the LSE, at the fund. He's now a professor at LSE, also a professor in China, and also works as a professor in Germany. So he's in many different countries. Plus, Ihtisham is a fiscal expert. He's worked in many different countries, especially currently he's working in both Mexico and China, but he's worked in many different countries. And he knows the fiscal area very well. And to consolidate that further, Ihtisham has edited two handbooks of economics. You know those handbooks which are very famous? He has a handbook of multilateral finance and a handbook of fiscal federalism. So Ihtisham is an expert in this area. I won't go further into his introduction. I would like to invite Ihtisham to make his presentation because I know he has a lot to say. We have been talking to each other for a long time, and I know Ihtisham, he's a very detail-oriented, solid researcher. I'm sure you will enjoy his presentation today. Ihtisham, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nadeem. Salam alaikum, everybody. Thank you, Shaukat Saab. I'm actually not going to comment on the current Pakistan situation, not having worked on it recently. But I will say this, that what we tried to do in 2009 and 10 was actually implemented in Mexico in 2012 and 13, with the result that they have increased their tax GDP ratio by about 4% in a fairly short period of time, 4 percentage points from 10 to around 15. And some of the reforms in Mexico were later on copied in China. And I'll point in particular to the value-added tax and the role of the value-added tax in creating a level playing field. And what China did in 2015 was the opposite of what Pakistan did in 2011. And what they did was to integrate the VAT on services and goods. And the objective of this was to reduce the cost of doing business and to provide information for improvement in the income taxes. And this also had an effect on the design and management of special economic zones. And I'll come to that because that's critical in looking at a growth strategy. So I'm going to talk in general about analytic issues, some history of Pakistan, but then what lessons we can draw from China. I've been working in China since the 1980s, and Mexico, also been working in Mexico since the 1980s as an academic, as an IMF staff member, and then again as an academic from 2012 onwards. Let me share my screen. And if people can let me know if they can see it. Can you see it?
Yep, you can. Yeah,
Terrific.
you can.
So as Nadeem correctly pointed out, I have been engaged in tax reform in Pakistan since the 1980s and had, I guess, the honor of making recommendations to the 1985 Kamrul Islam Taxation Reform Commission, together with Professor Lord Stern. Although many of those recommendations were incorporated in the report, they still remain pending. And I would suggest that somebody should look at it. I was in Pakistan in 2019 when I met Mr. Tarin and the Prime Minister, and I asked FBR if anyone had seen the 1985 Taxation Reforms Commission report. And no one had even heard of it, and they couldn't find a copy. So maybe you can ask your people to dig it up, Tarin Saab. What I'm going to talk about today is the historical background. And recall that, at independence, Pakistan had a major problem of revenues. It did not have central revenue tax collection capabilities. And what it did was, under Liaquat Ali, was to take over the final point sales tax from provinces, because it had a huge problem with revenues and revenue administration. And I'll come to the compensating Raisman revenue sharing award, largely because it was inadequate. And that sharing award led to the seeds of the disintegration of Pakistan. So this is something that one needs to keep in mind. Also, with reference to the 18th Amendment, 18th Amendment was basically copying the US government or governance structure, devolving education and health to provinces and local governments. And what you see now in the pandemic is that you cannot disentangle healthcare from the coordination from the center and financing. And this is true not just in Pakistan, it's true in China, it's true in the United States. So there has to be a reconsideration of the assignments, which were the core of the 18th Amendment, in light of the new stresses and strains from the stress test of the pandemic. Talk a little bit about theory. As Nadeem had said, this was largely to be a seminar for PIDE graduate students, but I will skim over most of the theoretical discussion. Tarin Saab is here. I'll just say that tax reforms is not just about revenues. It's about incentives. It's about incentives facing producers and investors. It's about distribution of income. It's about incorporating effects on the environment and externalities, and has to be consistent with investment decision and a growth strategy. And my good friend Nadeem has been on and on about an appropriate growth strategy, and he's right. You have to have in mind a growth strategy for long-term development. And this is what we had tried to emphasize in 1985. It's in the book that Stern and I wrote in 1991. It was at the core of what Shaukat, Tarin and I tried to do in 2008 and 9. It's not just revenues, but to create a basis for sustainable private investment, not tax breaks, but sustainable private investments. Then you have the whole issue of how you deal with this issue in a federation with multi-level finance. Even in a country like China, which is not a federation, multi-level finance has always been central. And I'll come to this when we talk about China. There's been a lot of reconsideration of theory and just the application of what happens in the US to the Pakistan case, for example, is an example of what was known as first generation federalism theory. And a lot of the analysis and analytic work since then has been to look at incentives and institutions, how institutions function. And the way institutions function in Pakistan or the way institutions function in China are very different from the way institutions function in the United States. So one has to be very careful about US-centric models. They don't even work in Europe. So, you have the closest political systems, but the institutions are different. One other issue that is absolutely central, and it relates to a point that Shaukat Saab just raised, is that own source revenues at the provincial and local level are critical if you're going to be providing access to credit to cities and provinces. And by own source revenues, it's not the revenues you get from the Finance Commission or the shared revenues. It's the revenues that you raise yourself by imposing an additional tax for specific purposes. So own source has a very particular definition in multi-level finance, and what we consider as untied, as own resource, is true in some senses, but not for credit. And then, of course, the political economy issues are critical. China, 1993-94 reform, which I had the honor of being associated with, as a number of people helped the Chinese at that stage, and Mexico in 2013 had tax GDP ratios at the time of 10%, but very different political systems. What China did in 1993-94, and again in 2015, and what Mexico did in 2013, despite differences in political systems, the instruments they used were similar. That's the main lesson for Pakistan, that the instruments used in emerging market countries were similar despite political systems differences. So really what we'll talk about a little bit at the end is some things for Shaukat Saab to consider.
And Hisham, I just want to point out you're still on the first slide. Is that
I know, I understand.
Okay, fine.
So the Pakistan context, you need a coordinated approach to tax reform with political economy and sustainable growth objectives, which Shaukat Tarin correctly points out now, and you have pointed out. But the sustained failure of tax reform over 30 years, the tax GDP ratio in 1984 was 14%. Kamrul Islam wanted to take it to 20, which is what you want to do now. And despite the VAT that was imposed, I would say, it was not a willing decision. The GST in 1990 by the PMLN government was not a willing decision. It was badly designed. It was implemented like an excise. And the VAT or the GST we have adds to the cost of doing business and does not facilitate automatic increases in revenues. So you've had a decline in basic services, and you've decentralized basic spending on healthcare and education without source revenues, and increasing risks, including with the investment strategy, including with COVID. And of course, what you're facing now is the likelihood of further turbulence in global financial markets. So that's the context for Pakistan that you're facing today. But going back, what you had after independence was a centralization of a revenue instrument, taking away from provinces something they had 100%. Provinces had 100% of sales tax revenues. Final point, sales tax are best managed and implemented at this provincial and local level. But Liaquat Ali had no choice, he took the revenues. The Raisman Award to compensate for this taking over of the provincial tax base was 50% of the net income taxes, but only 45% of that going to East Pakistan. 50% of the net sales tax collection in each province going back to the province, which sounds good, but except that they had 100% previously. And then they added insult to injury and said you can keep half of the excise duty on betel nuts and tea, which is grown entirely in East Pakistan. And to make it worse, they said you can keep 60% of your duty on jute, which is 100% grown in East Pakistan. So the seeds of disintegration were sowed right at the point of the revenue sharing after independence. Then there was a lopsided investments in the West, and I can go on about it. But the way the tax system evolved was tax breaks and protection to what Nadeem ul Haq called 75-year-old infant industries, mainly in the West. and increasing reliance on customs revenue. So inefficient production structure. And then that spawned the powerful interest groups that you face today, including for the GST in excise mode. And that's a constraint that we faced, Shaukat, Tarin and I, in 2008-9, and that's what Shaukat, Tarin faces today still. What the GST was designed to do and what is achieved is exactly the opposite. It was designed to reduce the cost of doing business, addressing competitive disadvantages, but it is now something which adds to the cost of doing business and does not create revenues or provide information. The 2008-10 administration, after you left, Shaukat, introduced SRO 283, which is the father of all SROs, giving the FBR the authority to introduce any SRO they wanted to at any time. So that was the point at which I broke with Hafiz Sheikh. I said, you cannot run this and have a serious fiscal policy. It had no impact on revenue generation or investment. So it was absolute disaster. Some of that has been clawed back, including by yourself. So what you've had is a lot of bad advice and political economy constraints. So in centralizing a final point sales tax was stupid, but it is best managed at the local level. And it laid the foundation for the separation of East Pakistan. And then bringing in investment goals and tax holidays and exemptions into the VAT, and then giving fixed or capacity pricing to meet IMF targets in the 1990s led to increasing cost of doing business. So the exact opposite of what the GST is meant to achieve. Then the 2010 split of the GST under the 18th Amendment was terrible, absolutely terrible, contrary to best practices and what China and Mexico have tried to reverse in their own countries, is to integrate the VAT, to provide the basis for a unified economic base. And then you get people coming in and saying to Pakistan, well, you got an incompetent tax administration. Why don't you go for turnover taxes? And to me, that is just shooting yourself in the foot, because turnover tax has been abandoned by every country in the world to add to the cost of doing business. Should you fix the FBR before fixing your tax reform? The two have to go together. Should you pay people more in FBR to collect more revenues? That's now not how modern tax administration works. It's not by paying an individual person more. It's the way the whole function of the system operates. It's a lot of bad advice being given. So what is the revenue target? I would say you need at least 18%, Shaukat Sahab. Try and get to even to 15 in your term. And you're living in a dangerous neighborhood, you need perhaps 18 to 20. 20 is your target. It was Qamrul Islam's target, but you've been stuck at 10% for 3 decades. Now, under these circumstances, what the PTI government started to do, and this was in 2019, and the point I made to the Prime Minister is that going after 99% of the population that does not pay the income tax, the personal income tax, is laudable, but ineffective, because most of the people in the tax net are wage earners. To increase the taxes on the wage earners, you actually make the system more unequal. You have to bring into the net the non-wage income people. And that's agriculture, that's finances, and that's real estate. And that can only be done if you have full information. And you can begin to make a start in that direction. It's unrealistic to think you can rely on the personal income tax. The Chinese have 1.5% of GDP in the personal income tax with a 21% tax GDP ratio today. And they have many more rich people than we do in Pakistan. Now they're trying to go after them, but the base has been laid. We don't even have the base or the information base. So there is a danger of rounding up the usual suspects in the public sector enterprises, in the public sector employment, in firms that are honest, and destroying incentives to invest, encouraging possible capital flight. So the lessons from China and Mexico moving out of the 10% trap is to focus on the VAT, to stop cheating, raise revenues, improve business climate. So I will not spend too much time on what I had intended to, which is analytic theory, is really you need to think about a coherent strategy linking taxation and growth. And you do that by guiding the same principles on tax reforms as you do on public investment. So you're looking at more than just physical investment, as Nadeem has been pointing out again and again. You need a focus on human and social capital, natural capital, and the environment and emissions. That gives you a design of public investment, and the same structure can be used to guide your tax system, because you want the two to go together, because taxes provide not just the financing, but the incentives for the growth strategy you're trying to achieve. Now, we had done some work in the 1980s, PDR paper in 1988 with Cody and Stern that you might want to look at. And that needs to be replicated. So how do you get a coherent strategy for investment and tax design? You have to do some background analytic work, which we have not done recently. So it has to be linked, however, to a growth strategy. Again, Nadeem has been on about a growth strategy. It's not just about creating a link from Gwadar to the Chinese border, or so a rail between Peshawar and Karachi, although that's essential. It's looking at basic education, health, human capital, and local functions, including water and sanitation, tracking support in the pandemic, to support private investment in clean, sustainable employment in new hubs, especially in lagging regions. So really, it's a coordinated strategy looking at investment, tax design, urban development, and local services, financing and delivery, so that you have the basis for private sector investment for sustainable growth in the long run, which is where it has to come from. It has to come from the private sector. The state cannot employ 210 million people. So multi-level finance, you have to have own source revenues for subnational operations to be accountable. At the moment, you have a share in a base that you can't actually implement. The GST on services is actually impossible to manage at the provincial level and destroys the value chain. So you really can't begin to raise rates on services in Sindh without affecting other provinces, without affecting firms. So I think some of the work that is being done now, Tarin Saab, to integrate and create a single portal is a step in the right direction. But it creates a problem. And the problem is that then the provinces have no sources of revenue over which they have control effectively. But you don't need a tax administration to provide that. I'll come to you with that from China and on Mexico. And of course, our property tax doesn't work either. You have 0.2 of 1% of GDP or even less. And then, of course, what you have is land sales. You sell to Malik Riyaz, and you have not land value capture, you have land grab for golf courses and luxury housing and apartments. And that leads to poor people being pushed out. Now, you said you were interested in the welfare of the poor people, and that's terribly important, but it's not by land value capture or land sales for golf courses by vested interests. And then, of course, the fiscal rules have to be looked at, and then you're looking at the employment hubs. Where are the employment hubs going to be created? What is going to happen with your special economic zones? Will the special economic zones create employment or not? Will it create linkages with the rest of the economy? Then you need full information on the buildup of liabilities. And this is particularly important given your comment on the credit that you're giving to farmers and people who are going to be constructing housing in the local levels. And that's terribly important also in looking at how you restructure cities. Getting more people into Karachi is not the answer. Can you use your CPEC and other connectivity investment in order to create new hubs in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa or in Balochistan, and particularly in Gwadar? So what you need is clean, compact, connected cities strategically located outside Karachi and Lahore for sustainable employment generation. If you want a clean and sustainable and equitable, as you're saying, you would like an equitable growth package, that's essential. So this is an example of how GWADR, the G, affects Chinese restructuring. Because remember that what they tried to do since 2000 was to move production inland. And it didn't make any sense for Chinese firms to move inland if they had to export through Shanghai and Guangdong and Guangzhou. But the moment you have GWADR and you've got Horgos and you've got the Western links, then the cost differentials change. Then it makes sense for the Chinese firms to shift their production. And of course, I won't go into this. This is the spatial dynamics of urban hubs. And the story here is that you cannot just rely on the connectivity infrastructure. So you had north-south high-speed trains in Italy, or the north-south rail, the autostrada in Italy, or the magnificent north-south highway in Chile. What has it done to the extremities? Nothing. So you can make matters worse just by focusing only on connectivity infrastructure. So you really have to be thinking about how you're going to get firms to move to the south of Mexico or south of Chile or south of Italy or to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan, especially GWADR. So that's really the story. I don't have time to go into the analytics of it. So what do we learn from China? I think this is terribly important. The first point to keep in mind is that China started off with a pretty high tax GDP ratio. At the end of the 70s, it had a tax GDP ratio of 30%. By 100% profits taxation on farms and state-owned enterprises. Deng Xiaoping realized that killed initiative. So he reduced the taxes. And of course, that just generated a lot of growth. Tax GDP, which was 25% in 1980, dropped to 10% by 1992, which is when they called the IMF. And in 1992, the Chinese government had no capability of redistribution, macro policy, or investment. They were getting 2% of GDP because the taxes were collected by the provinces and shared upwards, as they had been for, in Mughal times in India and in China for 2,000 years. They did not even have a tax administration. 1993 reforms that we helped them with was create a central tax administration. Again, we can talk about how that has performed, what they're doing now with new technologies, a complete change in the way tax administration is done, a new value-added tax shared with provinces, and an equalization transfer system. But what was very important in 1993, which was not done in Pakistan in 1950, was that they made sure no province lost as a result of this transformation. So there was something in it for the revenue sharing for the rich provinces. There was something in it for the poor provinces, and a revenue return to provide investment for the new hubs that were created. But the key element there was a lump sum, which made sure that the fiscal reform was Pareto improving. No province lost as a result. There was no individual compensation, but they maintained full employment by allowing people to move. So you had 800 million people come out of poverty, 150 million people move to the coastal areas. And this is just an example of what actually happened to the tax GDP ratio, which was 10% around 1992. It's gone up to around 20% now. And the revenue share coming to the central government, which was around 50% in the 1970s, has gone back to 50%, so they can actually begin to do redistribution and investment. And this is an example of what actually happened, is they allowed people to move. Actually, too many people moved. And then there was a process of the Western Development Strategy that tried to get people to move to Xinjiang and Sichuan, and firms would not go there, except with BRI. And CPEC is beginning to change the cost structure for Chinese firms. And that's a key issue in looking at what you can achieve with fiscal policy. And a key element in that was a 2015 reform, which the Chinese copied what the Mexicans had done in 2013, come to Mexico in a minute, they integrated the business tax on services with the national VAT. And they did that to reduce the cost of doing business and reduce the burden on firms. They expected the revenues would go down, but they did not, because it meant that there was less cheating from the income taxes. You had full information on the value chain. Also, it did a very important thing, which I think we need to keep in mind. It permitted the boundaries around the special economic zones to be removed. They removed the boundaries around Shenzhen, which allows Shenzhen to link with Guangdong, other cities in Guangdong, Guangzhou, Shuhai, the Greater Bay Area concept. So really what you've done with this reform is create a completely new type of special economic zone without borders and maximizing employment linkages. Now, India is trying to do the same thing, but they've made a dog's breakfast with their constitutional amendment. And 32 administrations, the benefits have, what the Mexicans and the Chinese have done, have not yet been realized in India. So what you've got is an innovation hub in China, which is like nothing else. And if we get time, we can discuss it. But the changing nature of special economic zones, something that you really have to look at. You're using special economic zones to generate investment and employment. You need to have linkages with the rest of the economy. And you do that with the full VAT. Let me move on to the local financing issue. What China did after 1993-94, they took away provincial tax bases. And the only tax base left was land sales. And land sales were used to finance infrastructure. But that led to increasing sprawl, congestion, pollution, and also corruption. Huge increase in corruption and rent seeking, and also generation of liabilities of unknown magnitude. So the 14 five-year plan looks at local on-source revenues to anchor sustainable growth, and US-type property taxes experiments in Shanghai and Chongqing failed. And we've been helping with simulating and designing new tax systems for property at the local level linked to local benefits. An example from 6 cities we can come back to: increasing, reducing the inequalities, increasing revenue collection in a transparent manner, generating 2% of GDP, enabling them to stop the land sales, which is so inequality in a generation. Mexico is similar to Pakistan. There's a federal system, tax GDP ratio stuck at 10%, has been since the 1990s, and it was largely because they continue to give tax exemptions to attract investment following the NAFTA agreement, designed to attract US investment, and they gave tax exemptions, lower tax VAT rates, etc. And the preferences and exemptions continue to cascade. And successive finance ministers since the 1990s tried to fix the income tax, tried to fix the VAT, but could not. And the tax GDP ratio stagnated at 10%, VAT of efficiency of 25%, like Pakistan. And they couldn't do anything about it. So the split base between the income tax and the VAT was facilitated by essentially a recommendation made by the IMF. What the IMF has been recommending to lots of countries is high registration threshold. What the high registration threshold here, which is 2 million pesos, did was to create firms below or around the threshold, which were invisible. It enabled large taxpayers to hide their transactions, hide their VAT, hide their value added, which is wages and profits, hide their output, and basically reduce efficiency. And of course, also the tax GDP ratio was stuck. And once Finance Minister Bidi Garai saw this diagram, he said, I know what to do. He just dropped the threshold effectively to 0. The other way cheating happened in Mexico was through the special economic zones, because it enabled carousel fraud, import fraud, export fraud. So be very careful about special economic zones. So I really emphasize this issue. If you have time, we can discuss this during the discussion. The VAT integration was critical. They dropped the threshold, rationalize the corporate income tax, abolished the minimum taxes, carbon tax was set at slightly above world prices. It was positive, and excise. So this blocked the ability to cheat. So no increase in rates, remember. And there was also no compensation given. So there was a minimum pension of 65 and above, but they did not utilize the oportunidades, conditional cash transfer, the equivalent of the Benazir Income Support Program, which was copied from Mexico. And then it was abolished by the current left-wing government because it created a poverty trap. And the poor regions continue to remain poor, even though lots of their people were getting this cash transfer. Something that people in Pakistan really need to look at. But what did it do? It turned the whole country into a special economic zone, with the exception of the South, the whole country. So if you're looking at the investments since 2013 of all the firms, it's not in the northern special economics all over the country. The trouble is that the southern states continue to lag and with negative growth. So what the current government is doing is something like CPEC. So they're investing in train. They've abolished the conditional cash transfer. However, the problem of getting states and local incentives still remains and comes back to our working recommendations and work in progress is how to finance these. How do you finance local government? In particular, before firms will move to Chiapas, before firms will move to Tabasco. So you're looking at how to move firms. It's like getting firms to move to South Italy. So really, you can do the infrastructure connectivity, but it's not enough. So the problems resist. And the focus on Mexico City continues to push out the informal sector into the neighboring states. And of course, you still have congestion, you have huge pollution, the city that's sinking. So it's like, if you look at Mexico, you look at the inequalities in service delivery, which are very closely linked to also the inequalities in income. It's like Pakistan, it's like the lagging provinces in Pakistan. How do you get firms to move to Balochistan or to the lagging districts? That's the question. Again, access to electricity, pipe water, drainage doesn't exist. How will a firm, or IT, for example? So, I mean, we have looked at all of these issues, and really what you come up with is a need for a consistent investment strategy linked to a growth strategy. So the whole story is generated by the growth strategy in the medium term. Of course, this is an example of what we showed you on the Chinese side. We're looking at Mexican provinces. A beneficial property tax, again, we simulated this for Mexican provinces to generate 1.5% of GDP. Actually, in many cases, improves income distribution even before you link it to public services. You link it to public services, and it's decidedly improving both the financing and the income distribution of local administration. So coming now finally to reform options, I know I'm going over time and Musharraf is getting anxious. What are the key elements of a growth strategy? You need a growth strategy to begin with, the consistent weights on income distribution, human capital, social capital, natural capital. Nadeem ul Haq has been on and on about this for at least 10 years, if not more. So basically, you need a sustainable growth strategy to begin with for both public investment, design at different levels of government, and tax reforms at different levels of government. Then giving tax breaks and energy subsidies to the rich or credit subsidies to finance land grab for rich communities and golf courses is just not sustainable, neither politically nor in terms of the generation of employment in the long run, which is what needs to drive the story. And what we had recommended, Nick Stern and myself, I think still remains valid today, is you need shutter prices for investment then linked to shadow prices for tax reform. And coming back to the point I started with, that you have to look at what is it in it for the provinces. Your NFC hat, Mr. Sian. You need to make sure that provinces do not suffer as a result of what will happen if you, for example, have a one-stop administration for the GST. Effectively, a one-stop administration of the GST re-centralizes the GST. Means that the provinces had absolutely no control, which they didn't in any case, because it's not possible for a province to jack up the GST on services without a major impact on investment and firms. So really, it was not very well thought through. I know that some of your colleagues on the current Finance Commission were pushed it very hard. I opposed it, but I was overruled. There were other instruments. There are other instruments. You didn't think about them. So really what you need to be looking at is creating sustainable employment. What is it in there for provinces and cities? Then you need to rethink special economic zone design. Remember that it's not just the linkages within Pakistan that you have to worry about, but the BEPS Pillar 2, which is the minimum corporate income tax, will mean that firms in special economic zones will be forced to pay minimum income tax to their countries of origin. So there is a minimum income tax. So the tax advantages that you're giving will disappear. So really, you need to be looking to replace tax holidays with indefinite loss carry forward, create a level playing field, which is acceptable under BEPS, to reform the VAT so that it doesn't matter whether you invest in the special economic zone or you invest in Peshawar or you invest in Sialkot. You need the linkages between Peshawar, Sialkot, and the special economic zone. So really, you need to be looking at the linkages. So creating a single portal is, for GST, a step in the right direction, as I said, but it involves need to look at other instruments for provinces, and in particular, consolidating the split personal income tax base, which is split, remember, in the Government of India Act of 1935, and it's a millstone around Pakistan's neck, and India's for that matter. So integrating the income tax the way you need to integrate the GST is terribly important. And it's not administration, it's the ability to set a rate on an integrated tax that matters for autonomy for provinces, to give you more revenues for the provinces, and you use the GST, full GST, to provide you information on the income taxes, which is what has happened in China and Mexico. With the integration of the VATs, they are able to go after the income tax because it provides information on the value chain. What is the value chain? It's wages and profits. Heck, you need wages and profits to know how they are changing. So it's providing information on the direct taxes. That's what the VAT does. It provides information. Then you can piggyback on the personal income tax on a consolidated basis to get much more revenues than the split GST, which has been stuck at 10%. You think it's increased revenues, but heck, it's nowhere near as much as it's needed. And you need to create an arm's length agency. China has integrated all tax agencies under one for every level of government. But it does not mean that there is no local autonomy. It's like the US. There's the IRS that does the administration of the income tax. The states set their own rates. And it's the setting of rates and getting the money directly that is critical, not replicating IRS in Georgia or in DC. It's not needed. And that's the big lesson from the Chinese case. You don't need a separate tax administration to get autonomy. And then accountability is having the ability to set the rate and piggyback on the consolidated income tax, and then a beneficial property tax for sustainable cities. And that's what I presented in a Mehboob al-Haq lecture in 2020, just before pandemic. So summary of recommendations for you to think about. I have not done any work on this for Pakistan, the way we have for simulated all this for China and Mexico. focusing on the personal income taxes, rounding up the usual suspect is likely to be counterproductive. It's taxing the salaried middle classes, doesn't raise revenues, does not create incentives for investment. So you want full information on the value chain, eliminate possibility of cheating, reduce the cost of doing business, create a strong economic space. Make sure that you have forces that come together rather than centrifugal forces. So avoid the mistakes we made at independence. And can make again by this desirable reform with the VAT management, GST management. It's desirable, but it runs a danger of alienating the provinces. And it does not provide them with this own source revenue. You can piggyback on a national personal income tax for including including agriculture, including real estate and finances. And of course, you can have a carbon tax. You do need a carbon tax, but give the provinces a share. You actually have a carbon tax. Tarin and I brought it in. It's called a petroleum levy. It was done in 2009, which was to just mop up the differential in the very high oil prices at that time. It set the rate, and as prices were declining, it created a carbon tax. It was struck down by the Supreme Court on the grounds that you could not create a tax without the revenue sharing. You also had to go to Parliament, which you didn't. But that's on the card. Every country is doing it. You want money from the fund for climate change? Create a proper. You have it already. Just call it a carbon tax and give the provinces a piggyback on it. Let them tax. Let sin tax tar coal. Is what I would say. And then you have key elements, which is a land tax. You can credit it towards USHA. That was one of our recommendations from our 1980s work. And then a beneficial property tax, which can be credited towards zakat, which is 1 to 1.5%. Avoid land grab. It's useless and it creates inequalities. And then think about your sustainable employment hubs. Think about turning the special economic zones into new urban hubs, and then transform rural communities. So you have an integrated framework with the tax system playing an important role, not just in the financing, but in the incentive structure. So I'll stop there. I think I've taken a little bit more, well, maybe about the time allocated. So thank you, Nadeem, for your patience, and Musharraf for yours.
Thank you, Disham. No, you haven't taken a lot of time. It's fine. I think this is quite adequate. But before I go to Musharraf, I just want to raise one question with you, maybe two questions, very short questions. One is that, Disham, that we have, as you know, we've been on this journey with the IMF to grab more and more revenues to meet these targets that they set. And in meeting those targets, as you know, very well know that we have put in all kinds of regulatory duties. We have put in withholding taxes. Roughly 70% of our tax collection is through withholding taxes. And the withholding taxes and the GST refunds are always an issue. Government doesn't refund the money or takes too long to refund. And there are a plethora of other issues that have crept up, like, you know, adding on, for example, excise has become a tax thing rather than a sin tax issue. So we got to, I think, if I'm not wrong, maybe I'm exaggerating, but we got a fairly complicated tax system, which is kind of self-defeating, and it creates all kinds of incentives to create a parallel economy. At the same time, now, in order to collect more taxes, the government is going on for all kinds of regulations. For example, bank accounts are being restricted, and, you know, the cash economy is being allowed to grow, or in fact even forced to grow. Now, the key issue that the government faces is, and every government faces, is, okay, we see your point, but the transition is very difficult to map. And no government can take the risk of moving this system, which is set on these crutches of distortions. So how would you address the transition issue? How difficult is the transition issue? Do we make too much of it, or is it really an issue?
That's really a superb question, Nadeem, and I think something that you have been worried about, I think, since the 1990s, and so have I. The transition actually is important. And we make things even more difficult for ourselves each time we have a balance of payments crisis, which is every 3 or 4 years. So, there's a ratcheting effect and it becomes more and more difficult. But, the basic issue is that, we have not had a government that's willing to tackle vested interests. None, not even Musharraf. He backed down at the first sign of opposition, but although he went about it the wrong way by going after retail businesses. I mean, it was just the stupidest thing to do. So really, I think what Videgaray did in Mexico after 20 years of the same problem in Mexico, the vested interests in Mexico are no less than in Pakistan, I believe you me, whether it's drug lords or they're, Carlos Slim or, the big magnates benefiting from tax exemptions and, ability to cheat on the special economic zones. So the same. But what he did was absolutely fundamental, is that he dropped the threshold. He brought everyone into the tax net, the VAT net to begin with. And that then had a knock-on effect on the income taxes. But you need here, the two structural measures is the integration of the VAT or the GST after the 18th Amendment, and the integration of the income taxes, which goes back to the Government of India Act of 1935. So it's more difficult in Pakistan. But somebody has to do it. And the trouble is that nobody has actually set out an agenda to do it, neither in analytic terms, which is to explain what needs to be done, nor in political terms, is to map out the pros and cons for different groups of the economy. Now, what the Chinese did, I mean, in a major, changing 2,000 years of Chinese fiscal management in 1993-94 was political economy. So what Zhu Rongji did in 1993 was to get provinces to agree to give up tax powers. And, they all agreed because, you had a loss, stop loss provision. Everyone got a lump sum of 1993 incomes. So nobody would lose. Everyone had a share of the new tax which was being brought in. And there was an equalization framework, so there was something in it for the poor provinces. But 2 provinces objected. And one didn't matter, and that was Hainan. The one that actually did matter was Shanghai. And we were sitting in Shanghai, and Zhu Rongji had been mayor of Shanghai, and he couldn't persuade them. So, what he did was, okay, you can keep your tax administration, but this is a new tax. The engine has to be central. We are setting the rate. We have the information flows. You can still send out the bills. And, he'd achieved what he wanted. It was absolutely brilliant. Now, you need a Zhu Rongji for Pakistan, and maybe Shaukat Tarin is the Zhu Rongji. But it has to be worked out. I mean, you have to understand the political economy constraints. And I'm afraid some of the people we have dealt with, both of us in the past, have not understood either the theory or what's involved in terms of the policies or the political economy. So, I mean, it's astonishing that most people actually don't know what a VAT is. If you ask them what a VAT is, the people who oppose the VAT are those who would benefit from it, the firms, etc. And they oppose it for different reasons, because they fear the rent-seeking opportunities or FBR or things like that, or actually because they believe it works like an excise, and therefore the incidence falls on them, not on consumers and not on export. Then you actually have to get full export refunds immediately for it to work. Otherwise, you've lost your main constituency, which is your producer exporter. So it becomes a tax. So really, I think it has to be going back to a coherent strategy for taxes, incentives, and then sequencing. Now, the stopgap measures actually don't achieve anything. I think by now, after 20 or 30 years, we should realize that the capacity taxes have not generated revenues. They don't generate investment. and they just create rent-seeking opportunities. So why keep going after this? This is what I would say to my friends in my former department in the IMF. Don't do this, you know. But you know,
we have a withholding tax on internet. We have a withholding tax on electricity.
I mean, this is just stupid. It's just stupid.
Even on school fees. Even on school
no,
fees.
I know why it's being done, because you don't have a proper income tax, because you don't have a proper GST. So get a proper GST and a VAT and an income tax, and then
Let me raise one more question with you. Ihtisham, we've just done about 11 papers on our new sludge series. Sludge is the cost of regulation. And we are trying to cost regulation in every area, from getting a trade license to setting up every activity. We are trying to cost regulation. And the point is, regulation is not coming out to be cheap, because it's excessive regulation. And part of regulation is also the excessive documentation that is required, the time taken and the trouble taken to open bank licenses, et cetera, et cetera. It's turning out to be from 12 to about 40% of cost. Now that operates like a tax too, as you well know, the Harburger tax. How would you interact this with a tax reform? I mean, part of the problem is that the business community says, if we are already overtaxed on this side, so why should we pay that tax? How do we get over that? You remember the meeting that we had in Shahbaz Sharif's office? How do we get over that hump?
No, absolutely. This is, there was the parallel in India was a committee by Justice Dudley. I think it must have been in the early 1980s, which was looking at regulation from, year dot. And he found that virtually every firm was in contravention of some regulation or the other. And that gave the tax administration immense powers for rent seeking. And it was basically a mechanism which was designed for and by the tax administrators to extract rents. And of course, these people pay taxes, but it doesn't come to the treasury, for heaven's sakes. So of course it's costs, and of course this is a key element that needs to be addressed. And at the same time, which is why I'm emphasizing again and again the need for a comprehensive reform, which is taxes, regulation, and investment design. Also, your growth strategy has to be brought into it. Where is the money going? So, our good friend Anwar Kamal, when we were doing the tax reform in the 1980s, said, where's the money going? He was right. You can't do it without looking at where the money goes. So, it has to be part of a comprehensive strategy. Is there bandwidth in the current government to address this? I don't know. I've become a bit pessimistic. After, I've been working on Pakistan tax reform since 1980, and I've been able to achieve more in India and in Mexico and in China than in Pakistan. Nafi Sheikh in a meeting with the Prime Minister in 2019 blamed it on me. He said, "You failed." I said, "Yeah, of course. It's my responsibility, and I failed." But it wasn't my responsibility. But I have, all this work I've done since 1980 is, at least in Pakistan, has had zero impact. Or it has had more impact, as I said. This is why I'm talking about Mexico, which has the same regulatory corruption, bad tax design, bad investment strategy conundrums as we face. I mean, Mexico is very much like Pakistan, which is why, the requirement to juxtapose Mexico and Pakistan is that when you talk about China and people say, well, China is different. Yeah, it is and it isn't. But then you bring in Mexico and you see they're doing similar things and they've actually got something done. You say, heck, maybe something is possible in Pakistan. These guys didn't, drop from the moon. Most of the reforms were done by the right-wing government of Peña Nieto, not particularly known for, transparency. They didn't do anything on the budget and treasury side, which is another thing. We can talk about this issue on governance questions, where the money goes, how it's managed, what happened to, disastrous programs to strengthen the Ministry of Finance on the budget treasury side. I mean, that's really, forget TARP, which is 150 million in 2004, partly paid for Musharraf Sayan's excellent work with Georgia State University. And then it didn't work, and they said, okay, how about 500 million, which is what the World Bank is giving now. So what's the result?
That's
Now,
like that's like how an amateur gambles in Las Vegas. You keep doubling and hoping to win.
Yeah, but the same thing happened on the budget side and treasury side. This is not a seminar about that, but if you were looking at really major fiscal reforms, you need to do both, and regulation. So I just say that the challenge is daunting, but you can't do it through partial measures, because then you will get tinkering, as you have had with these stupid measures, but that don't actually work. They don't work, but the problem is they don't work.
But we love to tinker. We love to tinker. We don't want to do a wholesale change. We love to tinker.
There's no time now for
the fact that, look, the transition is a problem, but you never want to map out the transition. So let me turn to Musharraf Sayan. Musharraf Sayan is a former civil servant turned to research. He was the professor at the Georgia State University, has done a lot of work on Pakistan, and as Sham pointed out, he's done some fundamental work as well, and he's been responsible for a lot of tax reform issues in Pakistan. Musharraf Sayan currently is an independent consultant working on many projects in Pakistan for various international donors as well as overseas. And Musharraf Sayan is also a member of the National Finance Commission representing Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Musharraf will give you a good idea of why we can't move forward on this issue. Musharraf, correct me if I'm wrong, partly the problem is nobody does any research on tax reform anywhere in Pakistan. Unfortunately, the donors do something, it comes from outside, nobody reads it. How do we solve this problem, as well as what Hisham said? Musharraf, over to you. Hey, Musharraf, are you there? We can't hear you.
Can you not hear me?
Yes, now yes, I can hear you. Go ahead, Musharraf. Get nearer the mic. Now we can hear you.
Okay. Is it all right now? Audible?
I can hear you fine. Go ahead now.
Okay. So I was saying that it's always a pleasure to be participating in a discussion with Dr. Ihtisham Ahmed, and thank you, Dr. Nadeem Haq, for giving me this opportunity to be part of this discussion today. I'll come to your question in a while. I have a few comments to offer to Dr. Ihtisham Ahmed's presentation today. I think a number of wonderful, very important points were raised by him. And I think learning from experience of these two countries, which are again multi-tiered like Pakistan, is very relevant. In particular, I think the idea of having these compact, clean, connected cities evolving from the previous approach of SEZs into something that might suit Pakistan, these are, I think, very important points to consider for policy. In general, what I was thinking while listening to him very intently, that much of what needs to be done in Pakistan has been known for a while. And the general principles, as we distill from the experience like countries like Mexico and China, of course, is relevant. But when we want to develop that into an implementable program for Pakistan, that's where the challenge is encountered in most cases. So I'll highlight a few points basically regarding this particular dimension of what Dr. Ahmed earlier was talking about. For example, I mean, the constitutional quagmire that we currently have in splitting the income tax and the sales tax bases is something that, of course, needs to be addressed. Unless we integrate the sales tax and assign it cleanly to the federal level, same for the income tax, the kind of revenue measures that we have tried, the kind of tax reform that we have tried, that is always going to remain elusive. The provincial level revenue raising that Dr. Ehtisham Ahmed was referring to, that again is likely to continue to be like that. Now, for that to happen, there has to be an environment of trust between provinces and the federal government. And in that environment of trust and some give and take, this dialogue can move forward. I agree, Dr. Nadeem Al-Haq, with you. One of the points that I wanted to mention is about there's no good technical work to basically lay out policy options or move the dialogue forward. For example, the National Finance Commission, which is a keystone in this discussion, in this revenue, not only revenue sharing, but I would also say that even if we wanted to revisit the expenditure and revenue assignment, that would be a key body where at least some of these discussions could take place. But right now, my feeling is that on the analogy of the 12 angry men, NFC discussions are largely 10 angry men discussing things, exhausting each other. There is very little technical work to back up those discussions or even frame the discussions and take a direction. Let me cite you an example. The 7th NFC, which is much celebrated, has some strange features in it. It improved upon the previous scheme and brought in some measure of equalization. But if you look closely, one component of the 7th NFC is actually counter-equalizing. Contrary to the theory, contrary to, let's say, good practice, what we did in the 7th NFC was we said there are 2 rich provinces of Pakistan and 2 poor provinces of Pakistan. 2 rich provinces which are endowed, I'm using the term rich in the sense of tax endowment. So if they're endowed with tax bases, then we should pay them more. So I mean, that's what the 7th NFC basically did. And this discussion of who pays taxes, again, is amenable to good technical work. People confuse the legal incidence of tax in Pakistan with the economic incidence of taxes. If a lot of, let's say, sales tax on goods is being collected in one particular city because most of the industry is located there, that doesn't mean that the economic incidence of taxes is the same as the collection point. So much of these discussions have, I think, been stalled over a period of time because good analytic work hasn't been done. The other, I think, important point is that if, let's say, any of Dr. Ehtisham Ahmed's recommendations, policy recommendations were to be taken forward, then again, the problem is with the detailed design of the institutions. Some of our institutions haven't developed, NFC being one example. The NFC Secretariat hardly knows what technical work is. It doesn't provide much technical support to the NFC discussions. Even at the provincial level, it's mostly political posturing and very little of technical work to take the discussions forward. If we apply the same principle of detailed institutional design to one of the points that Dr. Ahmed was making about the local governments, investing in social services and local public infrastructure, and ultimately becoming investment hubs or potential investment hubs for the private sector. Now, here the problem is that some of these very large urban centers of Pakistan are completely disempowered by the provincial governments. They cannot plan for themselves. They have almost no revenue raising powers. They have little control on investment decisions or even how to develop public infrastructure in their jurisdictions. So one way forward, the detailed design principle would be that if we want to, let's say, bring the lessons from Mexico and China to apply to Pakistan, then the challenge would be the detailed design of, let's say, how to create vibrant local governments or vibrant urban governments in Pakistan. Would there be scope for a discussion that these urban governments become like some kind of sub-provinces with a lot of autonomy to plan for them, raise revenues, and pursue their own development objectives? The same would apply to the issue of simplifying VAT and assigning the 2 tax bases together as one tax base at the federal level. So I think what Dr. Ahmed was saying, it's some kind of a simultaneous optimization problem, because you have to fix tax administration and tax policy as well as a tax assignment question. So to do that, again, where Dr. Nadimullah, going back to your point of the absence of good analytical work, and that analytical work not opening up the debate beyond the emotive political discussions that are generally held in this domain. This is another area. For example, if let's say we were to reassign the sales tax bases at the federal level, combine the two income tax bases, then perhaps we'll have to revisit the entire tax assignment question in the Pakistani Federation. Perhaps this a clean assignment of tax bases between the sub-national governments and the federal government may not be the way forward. We might need to share the revenue productive bases with the provinces. Suppose that some kind of an income tax sharing piggybacked on the federal tax would be required. If that were to happen, I completely agree that there is no need to have multiple tax agencies, because that creates a lot of complications. Instead of a federal tax agency, we can move toward having a national tax agency. But again, that would require the trust between provinces and the federal government. Currently, what has happened is that under the 7th NFC, the failure of the federal government and the FBR to collect revenues as were targeted in the 7th NFC. Now the pressure in the current NFC is on the provinces to adjust somehow the other that failure, either on the expenditure or the revenue side. So I mean, in this kind of an environment, that kind of a rational reform, a reform that would require an open dialogue between the provinces and the federal government in an environment of trust, that becomes far-fetched. So to get there, I mean, if let's say there's a good study that brings out why the federal government or the FBR has failed, of course the answer lies in who is controlling tax policy, because you cannot say that it's only a failure of the FBR, because if the Federal Ministry of Finance controls the tax base and during the tax year plays around with tax expenditures, we don't know what sort of tax expenditures are these. There is no good analysis to say what economic policy objectives these tax expenditures have served, whether they are working, whether they are not working, are they just revenue loss measures? So I mean, a lot of, I think, good work in these areas could help build that environment of trust where these larger questions could be addressed. So I could go on, but I think I'll stop here. I'm conscious of the time. So back to you, Dr. Nadimullah. Thank you very much.
Musharraf, tell me, isn't the NFC the forum to develop that trust? And NFC comprises mainly of regional experts. Can't you kind of hammer out some kind of a solution to this issue? What Yatisham is saying, and I was there when these 4 provincial agencies were created, and I thought it was a very bad, I agreed with Yatisham, it's a bad idea, and it was created by one individual. I won't name him, you know him. I think it was childish. But can we not reasonably sit down and discuss this at the NFC? And sure, we can get technical, do the technical work. Besides, I'd also like to ask you, what is this $500 million World Bank project doing, if not giving us this technical work? I mean, I know TARP went away and we didn't get anything. Now, are we going to get anything from this project too? Otherwise, we are happy to do the technical work for you and PIDE. But can this NFC not be activated to develop that kind of trust to make things work along with the technical work?
Dr. Nadimullah, I think NFC is the body to actually to take the initiative, take the lead in building that kind of a trust. I think currently the NFC work is, I should say, kind of hampered by the lack of tradition of bringing technical items to the NFC table. The one example that I was citing to you, that it's always a political give and take, and if you look at that, the way our NFC discussions are held, sometimes actually it's beyond the scope of NFC, the kind of adjustments that happen between provinces and the federal government, and sometimes, between the provinces also on the natural resource sharing and other arrangements. I mean, I think that NFC is a forum where these discussions should happen. Recently, when not very recent, a few months back, when the NFC created these technical subgroups, one of the things that I vouched for was to actually talk about this assignment question as well, and in the future to see how this sharing of bases could happen. But I think running numbers and doing that technical work will help move these discussions on, and see that actually these are not no-go areas, and people don't need to be very sensitive about these. These are just policy questions that should be discussed in the technical realm and then ultimately in the political domain as well.
And the World Bank can't do it in that project, that big project?
So I don't know. I'm not very familiar with that project, so I cannot comment on that.
Okay.
If I may, yeah,
please.
I would like to thank Musharraf for his very thoughtful comments, and it would come as no surprise that I actually agree with everything he said. But let me highlight a couple of issues. I think that, the worst thing possible is to have an NFC comprised of 10 angry men with no technical work. Because really, and I saw this happen in 2009 in the run-up to the 7th NFC award. There was just no analysis. And I've also worked and provided inputs into the Indian NFC. They do a lot of very significant and substantive technical work before they come to actually pronouncing on policy issues. So if you look at the Indian NFC, I mean, a paper is also written for the Indian NFC. There is a lot of work. Now, the question really is, do you need a proper secretariat? And I think perhaps you do. And, maybe PIDE can play that role in the short run. But, you can think of a secretariat which works for 4 years before the NFC begins to sit down and make recommendations, so that you have a terms of reference of the issues to be discussed, the analysis, the pros and cons of different measures, the political economy questions, the institutional issues, everything that Musharraf has talked about has to be addressed. It's not just centralizing revenues. Political economy of sharing the personal income tax is critical in getting agreement on the unification of both the major taxes. So sharing in the sense, not just sharing the total revenues, but sharing in the sense of giving a tax base, certain percentage points that Sindh can apply, or that Khyber Pakhtunkhwa can apply, subject to a bound, so you don't have cross-jurisdictional tax competition, which is a lower bound and an upper bound. That then becomes a meaningful way to proceed with the personal income tax. It also unlocks the GST question. So in thinking about the political economy, now I did some work also for the World Bank. This was after I left helping Hafiz Sheikh in 2011, was to think about how this might actually look. And some of the issues which you mentioned were addressed in a brief set of PowerPoint presentations, which were never circulated, but I'd be very happy to share them with you, Musharraf. But I think everything you said is absolutely right. So you really do need a body that has the detail analytic work. I mean, to some extent, I was doing detail analytic work for the Chinese, or for the Mexicans. I mean, I left Pakistan, no one was listening. Mexican finance ministry said, can you come and help? Find out who is cheating and how much and why. And that then was the basis for the discussion of, the decision on just eliminating the registration threshold. Now, what that has done is to position the retail sector in Mexico, and I was in a seminar with the OECD and the European Commission and the Inter-American Development Bank about a month ago. CFO of Walmart said that that reform, which required all retailers to use electronic invoicing, facilitated the integration of Mexican value chains into the US value chain following COVID-19, and that every country should be doing it if you're looking to global integration in value chains. So really, I mean, there are lessons from other countries, which is why you're putting it on the table. You don't have to fall in the same holes and climb out again. This is the advantage of theory and of international comparisons. You look at international comparisons to avoid mistakes and correct for them.
Good point. Good point. Point taken. Let me take some questions on the floor. So Ihtisham and Musharraf, can you just keep tabs of the, keep note of the questions? I'll go to 4 or 5 people and come back to you. Shaheen and Nisar.
Assalamu alaikum. Hello, Ihtisham. I think I met with you at the World Bank. It was so good to hear you. You touched every subject. Now, I have a question. I'm just thinking, I've been listening to the issue of taxes in Pakistan for quite some time now, and I just think that it has been a very random exercise. You have mentioned everything, and I really think that it should be guided by the incentive structure and investment strategy. Prior to that, isn't it important that the structural shift should take place? When we look at, for example, urban sprawl, you see a lot of decades-old systems. The country is interested in importing cars, or not importing cars, but they import substitution, and they're promoting the ownership of cars, and then you see that other countries, as you said, we learn from the examples. We are faced with some environmental challenges, the climate change issues, and then having studied some of the cases like Bogota in Colombia and all that, and you learn that you could achieve certain economies of scale. So my focus is basically now to think about efficiency aspects, how each of our development focus points out how could we achieve efficiency. And the power sector in Pakistan, I think, needs a lot of restructuring, and the export sector, for example, the trades. I mean, you just mentioned the global value chain, and I really think that could also shape up the country very well in different ways. I really liked your comment on promoting the private sector, because the private sector is the one. Everybody has to be mobilized in Pakistan. It's not just the government who has to keep on doing certain things and just, playing the fiscal discipline in one manner or the other manner, and then, trying to rectify what the previous government had said. Having said this basic thing, and I hope you understand what I meant, because I was very encouraged to see that, you touched every aspect, which was, in my little knowledge, I embraced in terms of moving ahead with sustainable growth strategy. Now, my second concern has been that, people like you have been a real asset. And I know when I was studying in Quaid-e-Azam University, I have not been your student, but I heard about you. Then, I knew that you are somebody who can contribute a lot to Pakistani economy. How can, maybe Nadeem al-Haq has answers and other people have answers. How could you be deployed in the coherent, whether one government or the other government, to sustain focus on Pakistan economy and make it work? I think we need people like you who should be working consistently on Pakistan and, show results. And you need that support. I would like to encourage other people like Nadeem al-Haq and other people to sort of have focus on that.
Let me go to Sardar Fawad. Go ahead, Sardar Fawad. Oh, unmute, yeah.
सरदार साहब अपने आप को अनम्यूट कर लें.
Hello, sir. Are you listening?
Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Actually, I am asking about that the previous you have discussed about is only regarding Pakistan, but I want to know that is there some thumb rule or the tools of fiscal policy which are more effective in case of achieving the goal of sustainable development globally?
Okay, great. Thank you. Mahmood Khalid.
Thank you very much, sir. Again, as everybody is saying, excellent lecture, very thought-provoking. And at PIDE, since we are trying to work through in terms of providing assistance to FBR and others in terms of fiscal policy, so many ideas have come up. Small questions. One, you have talked about the BEPS, but for the timing in Pakistan, it's not that much discussed. But since we had an experience in terms of working or trying to get work in terms of the digital taxes, which the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Revenue Authority was trying to implement, do you think that the FBR or in general, the revenue authorities have to take this subject seriously? Second question is with regards to the informality, and you have very rightly identified the Mexican example of lowering down the thresholds. In Pakistan, we used to have constant growth rate given for the small scale or the cottage industry. But recently, the report which has come out from the PBS actually says that the growth rate was even more than what was reported or used in the calculation of the GDP. So do you think that the threshold or the taxation policies are actually leading our economy towards informality? The last thing which Dr. Musharraf has also pointed out in terms of the tax expenditures, 1.3 trillion, meaning 33% of the total revenue which was to be earned and was to be also shifted towards the provinces was given as concessions towards businesses. So shouldn't there be a policy? Because when we talk about the FBR performance, nobody talks about that 33% of the revenues were actually gone just because of the concessions. So actually the FBR has actually overperformed as compared to their targets, but it's not adjusted like that. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, thank you. Muhammad Ahmed.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. My question is Dr. Musharraf, actually. So, I guess when you're talking about moving the NFC discussion from a more emotive into a more technical discussion, we would definitely need some sort of measurability in terms of provincial GDP estimates or regional estimates. So these technical groups that are being formed, is there any work being done on specific measurable metrics? For example, there's a lot of work on satellite imagery to use as to measure GDP growth. So what's your take on that? How amenable do you think the NFC is to new forms of data? Do you think that that's a path that could go anywhere?
Okay. Last question, Muhammad Khurram Shahzad.
Yes, hello. I want to ask about the transfer pricing issue. That in laws, it has been made mandatory that the business transactions should be at arm's length principle, like also according to for tax purposes. So in your opinion, how could the arm's length principles and arm's length transactions with context of taxation, they could be made according to the fair value, like they could be made much more efficient in order to avoid taxation? What could be done regarding that? Thank you.
Okay, folks, you got 5 different issues. Sham, shall I come back to you?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me start with Shahina's very thoughtful comments. And indeed, efficiency is important. Sorry. Okay. efficiency is important, but so is distribution, and looking at the spatial dimensions of urban transitions is also critical, and it's not quite often done. So there's actually quite a lot of work, including in Latin America, that might be relevant and be happy to share. The issue of rules of thumb, which Sardar Fouad asked for, my own opinion is that there are too many rules of thumb, and they're generally wrong. And I have a paper, again, it's drawing on the Mexico and China work, which I'm happy to share. I can send a copy to the PIDE, and they'll be happy to pass it on. That many of the World Bank and the IMF actually look for rules of thumb, which work under particular circumstances. But unfortunately, these rules of thumb don't apply in reality when you come down to actually thinking about, say, Mexico or Pakistan. And quite often they represent experiences drawn from developed countries, like in Europe or in the United States, apply to emerging market countries. And as my good friend, who is Minister of Social Affairs in Mexico and the Vice President of the Inter-American Development Bank, Santiago Levy, he wrote in a book, it was on Social Security transplants from Europe to Mexico. He said, quite often what you have are good intentions, bad outcomes, because people don't understand the context. So you can have good intentions and you end up with bad outcomes. And another example of that is the land value capture issue. Again, what it requires is a careful discussion of the different instruments involved with land value capture, which is actually a functioning property tax system, functioning system on property sales, so you can actually get betterment levies, and then carefully design land sales. If you don't have that, you end up with land grab. Malik Riaz is picking up the choice properties and creating golf courses in Lahore and Karachi. So you have to be very careful about taking up the rules of thumb which are pushed out by the IFIs. They sound nice and are attractive, but they're generally wrong. I think the digital questions are complex, but terribly important. Let me give you an example. Supposing you take blockchain, and blockchain has huge implications for information flows, but also in terms of the institutional design questions. This is some work I'm doing with some colleagues at the World Bank as well, is thinking about what happens if you say started with blockchain on property transactions, or even blockchain on sale of shares, or on thinking through some of the more complex income tax issues. What you then get is a flow of information between what actually transpires at the local level, going directly to a central database, without the need to go through the current flows of information through the FBR, through the single account in the state bank, so on. So what you get is a possible rationalization of information institutions, not just revenue, but also the Treasury framework. Now that sort of opens up a new set of questions, which I didn't want to address here, but it's hugely important. And there's a lot of work underway on applications of new technologies. I'm not sure I understand. I'm sorry, my iPhone is responding. And then informality is hugely important too, but it's linked to spatial dynamics of structural change. And clearly you do need to have a proper analysis in order to be able to assess what's going on. And of course, clearly tax design drives it. Tax expenditures are important, but I think important thing to keep in mind, particularly in relation to the 7th NFC, is that the presumption under the 7th NFC, which I argued in 2009 was wrong, was an argument by some members of the NFC, who I shall not name, that argued that if you split the tax base and give sales to the provinces, and sales are a growing element in GDP, then tax collections will go up. This is mistaken. And what you have is no increase in tax collection. So the 7th NFC, linked to the 18th Amendment, gave a devolution of spending assignments on health and education entirely to the subnational entities, which require a minimum of 17 to 18% tax GDP collection. The tax GDP collection has been stuck at 10%. So what you now have as a result of the combination of the 7th NFC and the 18th Amendment on the assignments is unfunded mandates. So this country has unfunded mandates. So the whole structure has come apart, and it requires a little bit of work to put together. It's like, you know, the one horse shay, or the Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall. So, you know, somebody has to put it together. It's not going to be easy to put it together. Transfer pricing, clearly important, but, you know, it's part of a general issue. I won't go into the detailed ways of handling transfer pricing, which are important. We just don't have time for it. Final question from Shahina. In 2012, when I stopped working on Pakistan, one of the reasons was that I got cancer, and my wife forbid me to work on Pakistan. She said, you go there, nobody listens to you, you get sick and you come back. So you can work on China, you can work in Africa, you can work in Latin America, but you can't work on Pakistan, because you go there, you get worked up, and it makes more of a problem for me. So that's the reason I stopped working on Pakistan. Again, also sort of advice from my good friend Nadeem Ul-Haq in around 2012. So that's the reason I stopped, and haven't done anything since on Pakistan, which is why this is not really about Pakistan, but really options that people like Musharraf and PIDE really need to pick up on in developing and indeed Musharraf is right, that none of this works until you have an implementation strategy that addresses institutions, incentives, and, you know, long-term growth. Shall I think I'll stop at that, Nadeem.
We will indeed pick it up, but the problem, unfortunately, is the reason I say nobody should come back to Pakistan. Unfortunately, we haven't reached the stage of an audience yet. Yeah. There's no audience in Pakistan. As Musharraf said, we have forums without technical capacity. So even the cabinet is without technical capacity, and decisions in that fashion, you know, well, don't work. Musharraf, would you like to say something on these questions?
Thank you. I think one question remains that was about any estimates of regional GDPs. Currently, no work is underway, unfortunately, but like nightlight density and other, we in Pakhtunkhwa are trying to do that to see if we can, using that, we can compare the potential tax bases located in different provinces. But as such, this was my point, that I mean, this sort of work from the NFC Secretariat, if it were commissioned in time through the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics, that could have been very useful at this stage. But unfortunately, right now, we don't have any estimates of regional GDP.
Okay, great. Let me quickly, before I go, Ihtisham, give us some ideas on how PID, we've got Mahmood Khalid is leading our tax effort, and we have got not a lot of human capital, but we are trying to put 2 or 3 people together to have like a tax unit that can do the technical work on these things. I just want your very brief guidelines, and later on, of course, I'll impose on you, as usual, drawing upon my friendship, to help us do this better. But for the moment, can you give us just a brief guideline on how we should proceed?
I think a good place to start is by picking up on, you know, there's been a lot of work, as Musharraf has pointed out, on Pakistan. I would start, you know, by collecting all the taxation commission reports. How many people have seen the 1972 Taxation Commission report? It was chaired by M. Rashid, who was the governor of the State Bank. How many have seen that? Because, you know, it was the first one to mention the use of the value-added tax as a way of stopping corruption. And it was buried without trace until I found a copy. You know, I've been researching tax issues in Pakistan since 1980. I didn't even know that such a committee existed. Secondly, there was excellent work done by the National Taxation Reforms Commission, led by Mr. Kamrul Islam. You know, it's a 600-page report. How many people have seen it?
Right.
People didn't even know it existed. And then I asked then chairman of FBR in October 2019 if he could depute someone to look in their archives to see if they can find it. They couldn't find it. So, you know, there is a body of, you know, then I spent 10 years researching tax reform in Pakistan and half a dozen papers in PDR. So don't tell me you don't have it.
Then there's the Shahid Hussain committee, remember that?
But before you get to Shahid Hussain, there's my book with Nick Stern, which summarizes everything we have done. Theory and practice of tax reform in developing countries. It's a little difficult and it's used as a graduate textbook, but I would expect that your people should actually know everything in it and be prepared to update it.
They should.
Models and recommendations. Then, of course, you've got Shahid Hussain report, which is actually very good. And then you've got, you know, I've written half a dozen papers since 2010 on the Pakistan question. I'd be happy to share them if you don't have them. But, you know, first step is put together what you know. You've got priorities you discussed with the finance minister and with Dr. Musharraf. You know, he's on the NFC. He should be able to ask for technical work. Now, you know what, the way that the Indian NFC does its technical work is largely to contract with the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy.
Right.
And they have a standing, you know, group of fiscal experts, actually very good ones, and the Indian Statistical Institute. So really top-class people who do very serious work. So, you know, PIDE could, you know, we do not have a National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. You could have from what I see is you have the makings of a department which could perform that function. And if you're looking at what's missing, you remember PIDE was meant to support the Planning Commission and did a very good job in the 60s and 70s. But the equivalent of the PIDE in India is the Indian Statistical Institute, which continues to do absolutely outstanding work, both on empirical and theoretical, you know, mathematicians, statisticians, et cetera. They're very, very good on the Indian Statistical Institute with their campuses in Calcutta, Delhi, and Bangalore. Then you have, of course, the NIPFP was designed to provide support to the finance ministry of the federal central union government and state government. So it was designed to do that. So you have people who come, it also has training for officials in the ministries of finance and departments of finance, different levels. And it does, you know, a lot of the detailed background work. And, you know, one of my first external assignments after I joined Warwick University in 1980 was this program with Nick Stern, where we had research on India. And Raja Chalaya was the head of the NIPFP. And I spent a year as a visiting fellow in Delhi at NIPFP jointly with ISI. So, I mean, I did actually more technical work on India in India than I have in Pakistan over this period. I mean, my interventions in Pakistan have been fleeting in 2009-10, as you know. And since, it's been nothing. But, you know, we spent a lot of time on data analysis and recommendations. And we did the same thing with the with Pakistan in parallel, and then Mexico. So really substantive empirical work directed to key policy questions and how it links to the growth strategy. I mean, my goodness, you're the one who's done more work on the growth strategy and good work on growth strategy than, you know, all this mechanical stuff on physical capital. So you do need focus on natural capital and social capital, you know, high tech and so on. So you've been talking about this forever, as far as I remember. It's important, but then linking the two is also important. That I don't see has been done yet. So I think there's a way to build on it, and I think you have possibly an opening with your links with the new finance minister. I don't know how much support you're providing the Planning Commission these days, but clearly there is a need to definitely support the finance ministry. They don't have nobody, and FBR I think is pretty stretch, shall we say, has been.
Okay, fair enough. Musharraf Saab, what's your view on this, on PID's tax work? How can you help us? And rest assured, I'm going to draw on both of you, so please tell us.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. I think I've already recommended some of the PIDE fellows, PIDE's faculty to do some empirical work for at least Khyber Pakhtunkhwa government on NFC. So I mean, there are a number of, I think, good technical studies that if PID could work on that, I think that'll be helpful in reframing the issues. For example, one of the very emotive issues because of which much of what we have been discussing today is not really addressed adequately in these discussions is that for the last, I think, 2 decades at least, there has been this discussion that some regions of Pakistan are financing the rest of Pakistan. So this is, of course, connected with the tax assignment issue, because if you share the revenue productive bases with these provinces, then they will not have to make this argument, because they'll be able to raise revenues on their own through the shared basis. And then the NFC becomes, let's say, less burdened and could focus more on equalization. So I think that kind of, policy discussion backed up by numbers would be very helpful. So that could be one area, and I could discuss further areas with you when we meet, inshallah.
We will inshallah do that. Thank you, folks. This has been a very exciting 2 hours. It's gone by very quickly. It shows you the quality of the discussion always helps. It didn't drag at all. It just kept going. We could go on some more, but I think now we're kind of inundated with information. We need to chew upon it. Ehtisham, thank you very much for taking the time out to do this. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure Shaukat and everybody appreciates it. We will be in touch with you. We will draw upon you. Musharraf, the same to you. Thank you very much for helping out. Thank you for helping us think, and inshallah, I'll be in touch with both of you. We will make it happen. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, the problem in Pakistan is we haven't reached the stage where we accept the fact that policy is a complex task of research. Here, we tend to think of policy as a quick fix that should be done in a quick meeting, and we suffer from that. That's how we made the metro. That's how we got to the energy mess. That's how we got to the railway mess. We made a mess everywhere because nobody actually sits down to make policy. LNG, for example, we imported it without any serious research. I keep asking this question: where are the policy documents? And quite frankly, nobody's answered that question yet. Why don't we have policy documents? Yeah, sometimes there are some donor research, there's some research by people like Ehtisham and Musharraf, but that's not enough. The government must have its own documents that it owns. The government must have its own debates that it owns. Unfortunately, we're a long way from that. I hope it'll happen in your lifetime. I've kind of given up. It'll happen in my lifetime. But the key problem in Pakistan is the lack of thought before policy. We rush into policy too quickly, and we keep making mistakes and repeating the same mistakes over and over again. Thank you, both of you. Thank you, folks. Thank you, all of you. My best wishes to you all. Inshallah, we'll continue the PIDE dialogue in the next webinar. Thank you all. Bye-bye.